Welcome to another quick tips video. In this tutorial, I'm going to be going over just the basic edits that I do in Lightroom that is sort of the starting point before I take the image into Photoshop for the dodging and burning, content aware fill, Orden blur, and whatever else that I do in Photoshop, and then bring it back into Lightroom. This is just the first round of edits that I do. Every image is sort of different. Try to get a good variety here. Some water, forest scenes, Alaska, kind of winter stuff, waterfalls, Madeira. This is Mount Tamalpais, and just a decent variety. I try not to get anything where I would have to bracket the images. I probably would bracket this one for the sky and for the foreground, just to not really complicate this too much. But if I did have to bracket, I would sync all the edits to the bracketed images and then bring it into Photoshop for the masking portion. You can check out one of the other tutorials to kind of see how that goes down. So we have our images here, and let's get started. This image is taken on the coast of Kailua Kona, and sort of the tide pools that we have there during sunset. So to begin, I will first go and do the lens correction. Most modern lenses have a profile already set in Lightroom, and as you can see, that takes care of some of the lens vignetting and a little bit of distortion, though that will depend from lens to lens. Then I go in here and change the profile to landscape. As you can see, the default, it is not very punchy and sort of desaturated, and there are several other options here. But none of them really add the punch that landscape does. It does also increase the dynamic range. As you can see, it brightens up some of the shadows, and the main thing it does is the color. You can see there's a spot here on the lens, which is kind of annoying, and if I was doing the Photoshop portion of this editing, I would take it in there to content aware fill that, but we're not really going to do any of that. So like I said, we changed the profile. And then next I like to do is the white balance, and there are different ways of doing it. You can either pick something that is sort of white in the image, or you can try some of these presets depending if it was a cloudy day, if you're sort of in the shade, maybe in a forest, and these are some of the tungsten and fluorescent flash presets here. But I like to do a mix of all of them, and then from there play with these sliders a little bit. I tend to go a little bit more magenta in my sunrises and sunsets, though it will always depend on what colors are present, because you don't want to make colors that aren't really there. You sort of want to accentuate it. From there, we bring down the highlights and bring up the shadows. Now in the past, what we used to do is bring the highlights all the way down and the shadows all the way up and create this crazy HDR kind of thing. It also pushes the image way too much, and you'll see there's noise here in the shadows. So you don't really want to do that these days. I personally wouldn't bring them past the midpoint. Like I said, if I had to really do this image correctly, I would use the brackets and use something for the sky and something for the foreground. But for the sake of this tutorial, we will keep it just sort of even out the exposure. There are ways that you can bring in masks here and maybe drop that onto the sky. Lightroom has recently changed the way that they deal with masks, so I'm not really going to get into that in this video. I'll probably do a separate video for that. But you would basically bring down the exposure, maybe add a luminance range here, so that it doesn't affect the darker areas. Invert that, and if you show the luminance map, you can see what areas it's affecting. You really only want to darken the brighter areas, but if you get too crazy with it, it looks very strange here, so you might have to expand that to a point there. But like I said, this is just a quick demonstration, and I probably will just delete this. So there we have our kind of highlights and shadows, balancing out the exposure. I will always add a little negative clarity. I have a tutorial on the Orden blur effect, but this will kind of get that started and just kind of soften it, making it more of a dreamy look. You can use the backslash button to get a before and after to see how far we've come here. I don't really touch vibrance or saturation, because when you add contrast later in the other steps, you're going to punch the colors a lot more, so I would leave that alone. This tab over here, the calibration, is a little bit tricky and hard to explain. It's basically changing the way the certain hues are perceived in the image, the reds, the greens, and the blues. So what I will do, there's a popular Instagrammer look where if you just drop the blues down and you get that orange and teal kind of thing. It's not really what I like my style to be, but if I do see it a little bit too maybe orangish or magenta-ish, I will probably tweak the greens and the reds a tiny bit. You can see it's a very subtle effect. It makes the oranges more red. Sometimes I will mess with this one, but in this case I don't want to make them more red than they already are, so I will leave the blues alone. And for every step and every effect that you add, you want to kind of see the before and after of that single effect or edit, and then of the whole image using the backslash tab, and kind of see how far you're coming. You don't want to overdo things. Editing is usually a combination of a lot of subtle things that you add to an image. Next, Adobe has changed the way they do the color grading. It used to be only shadows and highlights. Now there is midtones in there as well, though I don't really mess with that. You can either do grading with this, or you can use a tone curve, but to be honest, it's a lot easier just to use this, where you can maybe add some certain color to the highlights. Usually you want to add opposite colors, so if you're adding orange to the highlights, you want to add blue to the shadows, though sometimes I probably go more to the magenta in the shadows. And you want to be careful with this because it's easy to overdo. Let's see a before and after on that. And if you have any overexposed areas, it helps to add color to the highlights because it sort of makes it look less overexposed. And then adding something to the shadows is more of a color grade, and it looks kind of green before and more magenta after. That's probably as much as I would do there. So that's about it for these basic edits that I do in Lightroom. As you can see, it is a very dramatic improvement in the image, and some people would probably just even leave this as is here, but I would definitely take this into Photoshop. You know, content aware fill, some of these things around the border of the image, dodging and burning, Orton blur. If I was shooting this, if I was editing this correctly, I would do the bracketed method because there's a lot of overexposed areas in the sky, as this image could not be captured in a single image. And then I would bring that back into Lightroom. You could watch one of my full tutorials to see a full walkthrough for that. Moving on to something a little different here, we have a waterfall from Hawaii. You can see I accidentally had this in 16:9 mode, so I'll increase that back to its full actual sensor size here. And like last time, we will go add the lens correction. Sometimes it's already clicked, which I don't know why it does that, but we will do that anyways. We will switch the profile to landscape, and that's a dramatically punchier shot right there. A little before and after, and it's already looking better. As far as the white balance, I believe this was an overcast day, so it is going to be sort of bluish. I might warm it up a tiny bit, and then color grade. In the color grade tab, add a little bit of blue to the highlights. It's just a sort of look that I like, but I think that's probably good for the white balance right there. We'll bring down the highlights because the waterfall is a little bit overexposed. Bring up the shadows a little bit. Luckily with flat lighting, you don't have the harshest of shadows and highlights here, so it's pretty even, I would say. Another key thing you want to do is always check your histogram, because your screen brightness can be deceiving, and you might think you have a perfectly balanced image, and it's actually too dark. You know, if you see a big gap here in the histogram, it means that your image is too dark. If you have too much going on this side, it'll mean that it's overexposed. So you want to somehow fall sort of in the middle. Some people lift the blacks a little bit, but now that I'm looking at it, I am actually going to bump the whole exposure a little bit higher. My goal with these basic edits is to have a sort of flat image, and from there I will add the dodging and burning and the contrast later and sort of tweak it into the way that I envision it. Next, we will do a little negative clarity as usual, jumpstart that Orton blur effect, and then we will get into the calibration tab here. Now, when you have a lot of greens, when you're shooting forests or jungles, it's going to be different than what we were dealing with here. So, for example, you can make the greens more green, or you can make them more yellow. And you can do that also with this tab here. You basically mess with the sliders and go to the extremes and sort of see what they're doing to the image, and that's the best way to kind of figure things out. So I definitely don't want to make the greens yellow because this is a very lush kind of jungle here, so I will move those the reds over and the greens over a little bit, and you can see that makes it just more green than it was at the beginning. And this, of course, would do the opposite of that. But you know what? Now that I'm looking at it, I might add a touch of this, and not till we lose the greens, but till we get some more reds over here. Something that I'm going to get into that I didn't really mess with on this first image, because it really depends from image to image, is the HSL tab. Now here, for every individual color, you can adjust the hue, the saturation, and the luminance. So the hue is basically what type of, for each color, a yellow can be made to look more green on this end, or more orange or red on this end. Now this is useful if you want to create a color contrast. Like for example, I see too much green going on here, so I'm not really going to mess with the green itself, but I am kind of liking just bringing some reds in there so there's some contrast between these kind of orangey areas and the green. Otherwise, if you have just too much green, it's very one-dimensional. Same thing with the oranges. I'll probably make the oranges a little bit more red. The reds I don't really touch so much up here, and like I said, the green I will leave as is because it is green enough for me. Though I might punch it. I might move the greens over a little bit. There's no really blues in this image except for what I will be adding to the highlights, so I'll leave those alone. And a little quick before and after, you can see we've added a little color contrast there. In the color grading tab, instead of adding orange, because it's really a color that does not exist in the highlights, I prefer to add blue, and it'll give it a sort of cooler feel to the image. So you can see it's affecting the water here and then some of the highlights on the top, and it kind of cools the whole image down and just seems to be a more pleasing style of image in my opinion. Quick before and after, we can see we've come a long way. It's definitely more saturated and sort of tweaking it the way that we like here. That's about it for this image. There are some things that I would do in Photoshop, like border patrol over here, remove some things, maybe dodge and burn some of these areas, and just make it more contrasty because, like I said, it was a very flat lighting type of day. Here we have a sunset at Mount Tamalpais in California. So this was actually shot with a non-native lens, so I can go in here and look at all these brands of lenses, and I can find this was shot with a Canon 70-200 f4. So actually, just by picking the Canon brand, it found what type of lens it was shot with somehow, even though the data isn't embedded in the file. But needless to say, that takes care of a little bit of vignetting, a little bit of distortion. Change up our profile here. And it's definitely a little underexposed, but it's fine. I believe this is a bird flying here, which I would Photoshop out. And then as far as the white balance, I like it to be very golden as it is right now. So I probably won't do much. I'll do a little bit of color grading, but I won't really adjust the white balance. Bring down whatever is for the highlights, which is not really overexposed anywhere, and then definitely bring up the shadows a little bit. I like having details in the shadows, and then I can increase the contrast later. This is an image that is pretty hazy to begin with. It's one of those effects that you get with the long focal length, the long telephoto lens, and as I mentioned in one of the tutorials, you have a natural haziness in things that are further away from you. So I will decrease the clarity a little bit, but it almost looks good just as is. A little Orton blur might help it a little bit, but it looks pretty good like that. As far as the calibration here, like usual, very mild move to making the oranges more red, but nothing too crazy. And then in the color grading here, I will add a tiny bit to the highlights, and in the shadows I do not think I want to add any color because it looks kind of unnatural. So just a little bit to the highlights. Sometimes I don't really mess with the shadows, and I just grade the highlights a little bit. Just keep an eye on that histogram, make sure it's pretty evenly exposed. So there's another image that looked pretty good in camera and didn't require much editing at all. Now I'm going to skip one image because I don't want to do two Alaska images in a row, but we have this image here. This was in Madeira. It's one of the waterfall trails. And this is also a very high contrast or high dynamic range image, so I would normally have to bracket exposure this. And I would have to focus stack. As you can see, this shot is focused on just the fern and it's blurry back here, so I would focus stack and bring in the brackets, which require basically 6 images, 2 sets of 3, to really do this the right way. But for the purpose of this tutorial, I'll see what I can do in Lightroom here. So let's change the profile to landscape. Let's see and make sure the lens correction is already done there. As far as white balance, it was pretty much middle of the day, so I will probably go something a little cooler than warmer here and bring down the highlights, see if I can recover that. And like I said, I would normally use a bracket here because that is definitely overexposed in the back, but not really much we can do with the single image. Bring down some negative clarity, and this will be edited sort of similar to this Hawaii photo, though we have more contrasted lighting, harsher lighting. This was shot in overcast conditions, so it will be slightly different. But let's go into the calibration tab and make those greens a little bit greener. Then we'll go into the HSL slider and maybe do the same thing what we did with the yellows. As we can see, we're changing some of these moss or lichen or some kind of thing on the rocks. And you, like I said, you want to find color contrasts, so the orange and the blue, if we look at our color wheels here, orange and blue are opposite. Green and red are not exactly opposite, but they're 1 degree of separation away, and they also make for a good color contrast. So by making those yellows more orange or red, we add a little bit of color contrast to the image. Punch up the greens a tiny bit. And that's about it. I really only mess with the orange, yellow, and greens, sometimes with the blues. And because this is shot in the middle of the day, I probably won't do any color grading. The sun was just overhead, regular light, so if I add some kind of warm, as if it was a sunrise or sunset kind of grading here, it just will not look very natural. And doing the cooler color grading, the cooler color grading on the highlights, maybe I'll do a tiny bit of that, but not as much as I would have done on this image here. So a little before and after. A lot of this image is really just taking care of the dynamic range here, and you know, bringing down the highlights and bringing up the shadows here. So that is probably good right there. Now let's jump back to this Alaska shot right here. This is shot with a telephoto lens at sunset, and all our basic edits. So a lot of the toning in this image is already there. It's got the orange and the blue in the shadows, and so the color contrast really does not need to be added. Sometimes you get lucky and you have conditions or an image where it's almost, you're trying not to mess it up and you want to be super light with your editing. For example, I don't know that I even want to mess with the white balance here, because I really like that blue and orange contrast. I might just warm it up a tad, but I really like the blue in the shadows here. Looking at the histogram, it does seem to be a little bit underexposed. So in this case, I probably wouldn't go to brackets, but I could drop a linear gradient with a very soft gradient, and just bring up the shadows a tiny bit using the luminance range. And like I said, I will have a separate tutorial on how this all works because Adobe has recently changed it. And actually in this case we want to avoid brightening the bright areas, something like that. Well, before and after, it's a very minor adjustment, but like I said, you really don't want to push the shadows too much over here because you get the haloing, and it's not a very desirable look. Drop down the negative clarity. Little before and after. This image was just so good straight out of camera that I don't really want to mess with it. Like I said, maybe make it a little bit more red here, and definitely not this. That looks pretty good, and it's a very good starting point, so I would say that image is done right there. Next we have a tree that I shot in Scotland with the moon right overhead. A very lucky shot as I was driving by. This was also shot with a Canon lens, so I'm gonna have to find the profile manually there. Color profile, definitely bump up the exposure. And as far as the white balance, I don't know how sunset I want to make it because I do like this blue, very soft natural gradient in the sky, and I don't think I want to add too much magenta, just a tiny bit probably. Probably going to keep it as is as far as white balance, and then even out the exposure here, highlights and shadows, little negative clarity. This is a pretty simple composition, so it doesn't require a lot of work. Tiny bit messing with the reds and the greens. And again, I don't think it really requires, if I add anything to the highlights here, the blue starts to go away. So if I add anything, it'll probably be a very slight to the highlights and really nothing to the shadows. And then with dodging and burning, I'll take care of some of the things down here. But that is that image right there, pretty simple. So here we have our images, before and after. And this is why travel and repetition is probably the most important investment in your photography, because as you shoot in different kinds of lighting conditions, you will then edit in different kinds of lighting conditions and see what works and what doesn't, because light is really the pursuit. We are in the pursuit of light in photography, and just interesting kinds of lighting on different kinds of landscapes, and then your own editing style will come into play as well. But this is how I get started. Then I would bring that into Photoshop and do everything else from there. You can do a lot in Lightroom. It's definitely not your one-stop shop, but between Lightroom and Photoshop, you can come out with some pretty amazing images. I hope you learned something in this quick tips tutorial. If you have any questions, feel free to leave it in the comments section below, and make sure to like and subscribe for more photography tutorials and travel content.